Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for today's Winter Readiness Briefing. My name is Zach Hutchins, Media Relations Program Lead for the New York ISO. Leading today's presentation are Rich Dewey, President and CEO, and Wes Yeomans, Vice President of Operations. Rich and Wes will lead us through a few slides and then answer any questions you may have. All attendees should be on mute upon arrival. If you are not, please do so now. If you are in the Teams presentation, please indicate you have a question by using the raise hand feature. Once you are done with your question, please put yourself back on mute. Attendees on the phone can unmute themselves by hitting *6 and making sure their phone is also not muted. In the meantime, I'd ask that you do mute yourselves on your end, otherwise I'll have to do it on our end. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Rich Dewey. Rich.
Thanks, Zach, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for taking the time for joining our briefing today. These seasonal briefings that we do are vitally important for us to be able to assess our readiness to head into the capability seasons and also to communicate the readiness and any risks and concerns that we have associated with the upcoming seasons. New York State continues to be a summer peaking system, largely driven by air conditioning load, but we're acutely aware of the unique challenges present with managing a system through winter conditions. Specifically, we've updated and augmented our readiness assessment this year to consider some of the extreme weather events that we've seen in other parts of the country in the last year or two. Increasingly, and understandably, as a result of the impact of climate change, we're starting to see much more extreme weather, and we think it's important and prudent to be able to assess our readiness in light of those potential conditions which we could encounter within New York State. So we've expanded our assessment to consider some of those scenarios. In any regard, we do feel as we head into the winter of 2021-2022 that we do have adequate capacity resources to meet the demands in pretty much all modeled scenarios. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Wes Yeomans. Wes is going to walk us through the very specific stats and numbers, and then we're going to take a break and answer any questions that you might have. Wes?
Yeah, thank you, Rich. So I'll start by providing some projected capacity surplus margins, and then I'll move on to some more of the specifics of the resources and the demand. But we start out looking at what we refer to as 50-50 cold weather conditions, or that would be what are we expecting for cold weather this year, really late December, early January. And we reflect upon that peak and compare it to projected generation resources, and assuming all generation is available and has fuel, we are projecting about 9,080 megawatts of surplus capacity. And as Rich said, that's primarily explained by the fact that we're summer peaking. So if we're looking at the summer with these set of resources, the margins would be much lower, but with lower winter peaks than summer, we start out with some higher margins. Now moving on to some more a review of a colder type of cold snap, maybe once in a decade type cold weather conditions, the surplus drops to 7,916 megawatts. And something we're doing new for this winter's assessment is saying, my goodness, what if it was even more extreme than that? And as we watch the rest of the country, it's clear that can happen, some more extreme weather conditions. And it's almost, we're looking at once in a century type cold weather conditions. So that would be very, very cold. But we do have a projected peak load forecast for those conditions. And when we compare that to our supply portfolio, that would be about 6,875 megawatts of surplus margin. But now, really from a practical perspective, we have to reflect upon a lot of our generators only have interruptible gas supply, not firm supply, and a part of our fleet does not have dual fuel oil capability. So if we review the numbers all over again, reflecting upon only firm fuel supplies, the margins are lower, and for 50-50 expected cold weather conditions, we would project about 2,370 megawatts, and if it's even colder, like once in a decade, type weather conditions, that would be 1,566 megawatts of surplus capacity. And then again, if we were having once-in-a-century type cold snap conditions, and I hope that doesn't happen, the margins are as low as 526 as projected. Now, ultimately, how things go the day of the cold weather will be a function of performance of the generating fleet and the fuel systems, but these are our projections. If we turn the page, the slide, mercifully, I don't have to read all these numbers, but the best way to look at this slide is the third column. So the first two columns are just a review of last year's forecast. We can skip those. The third and fourth column are projections for this coming winter. And if we start with the third column, that's really, again, back to our 50-50 cold weather projections, or what we really are expecting and forecasting for late December and early January. And the first three lines is the sum of our three different categories of capacity. It's New York generators on line 1, it's demand response on what I guess I'll call 1B, and it's the net of New York State capacity and purchases on line 1C. And if we add all those together, we end up with a projected capacity resource of 42,415. And I'll bring to your attention that the nuclear power plant or unit Indian Point 3 did retire in April of 2021, and of course we're not expecting that for this coming winter. Indian Point 2 retired the year before that, so this top line would be lower by the Indian Point 3 capacity capability on line 1. Now it happens that the net of the purchases and sales jumped up somewhat for this winter, so we end up with 42,415. Then we say to ourselves, well, what are some projected D rates or outages of the generating fleet based on past performance, including what would be the wind D rates, because it's possible that we can have low wind speeds in the wintertime, and other just ordinary generator mechanical problems. And so we do a lot of math and look at a lot of history over the last 60 months, other cold weather conditions, and we just estimate about 6,690 megawatts of D rates. We subtract that from the starting point resources. That gets us down to 35,725. And then we say, well, what are we projecting for a peak load this winter? And at this point in time, our peak load projection is 24,025 megawatts. And by the way, that's about 100 megawatts or 95 megawatts lower than last year's forecast. It's higher than last year's actual, but lower than last year's forecast for 50-50. Now, we always commit and schedule additional generation to be prepared for losing generators on a cold day, or actually any day, and the extra amount we schedule is 2,620. That's referred to as our operating reserve requirement, and we add those together. The real capacity requirement is 26,645 megawatts for expected cold weather conditions. We compare that to the supply, and that's how we get the 9,080 of surplus margin. The fourth column, everything's exactly the same, except it's for 90-10, once in a decade cold weather conditions. So if you go all the way down to line 4, the peak load forecast, instead of 24,025 megawatts, it would be 25,189. So obviously, if it's colder than expected, once in a decade type cold weather conditions, we would expect a higher or stronger electric peak, and the margins would drop to 7,900 megawatts on the bottom line. Okay, jumping to the next slide, we just stress this two different ways. We add a third column for, again, 99-1 conditions, which loosely is kind of our once-in-a-century type cold weather conditions in the Northeast. Again, I hope that doesn't happen. And so most of these numbers are the same until you get to the load forecast on line 4, and you'll see in the third column on the right, you'll see 26,230 megawatts, so a higher peak load for once in a century, and we just do the same math against the same resources, and the margins drop to 525 megawatts. And I will be careful on the bottom of the slide. We do in 7A say to ourselves, what if we could not get any natural gas into New York State? So another way of saying, if we could not get one molecule of gas for generation, then you see these minus 8,834 megawatts. That's the amount of generation we would not have if we could not get any gas in New York State. And you see those margins on line 7 significantly lower, including negative. But from a practical perspective, some of our generating fleets do spend extra money to buy firm gas transportation service in line 1A. So if we add in from a practical perspective, we would expect generators with firm supply to get their gas. That's $24.84, and that brings the margins back up to at least positive, small, albeit small numbers on the bottom number. So that's how that slide works. Let's see, the next slide is something we do to prepare for winter as the operator of the transmission system. First of all, we are trying to pay attention to fuel, the fuel, what I'll call the fuel condition or fuel supply in the Northeast and across the United States, really just using publicly available information. It's no secret that inventories seem to be lower than in the past. Certainly clearing prices seem to be higher for this time in November. And then to the degree that there's future market prices, some publicly available, it does seem like fuel futures are trading at higher prices for December and January, which is just indicative of if we have cold or very cold weather conditions, we would expect higher than ordinary fuel prices. We do here at the New York ISO have a very rigorous seasonal and weekly fuel surveys so that we at all times know how much fuel each of our New York generators have either on site and what their replacement capability is. If they happen to be an oil generator or dual fuel, we're knowledgeable of what their barge or truck arrangements are. We're knowledgeable of their starting point, and then we pay attention to projected burn rates and work with the generators to just pay attention and just have operational awareness. If a generator was going to run out of fuel, we just like to know that. We need to know that so we know what other generation we would schedule. In the third bullet, we spend a lot of time, well, we've been doing this for years, working with the generators and surveying their maintenance practices, their preparation for upcoming winter conditions, when they last tested their dual fuel capability, cold weather, preventative maintenance, and just many items like that. Unlike the South, we do have cold weather all the time, and for the most part, our generating fleet, New York and New England and Pennsylvania, just because we have so much cold weather for so many decades, that usually the actual operation of the generation is pretty good in the wintertime. We're just kind of used to cold weather. And then the bottom bullet, this is important. We have a large role here at the New York ISO in coordinating transmission outages with generator scheduled outages. So there's always, a lot of maintenance work going on with the infrastructure, but we're very careful to not allow to schedule that during cold weather operations. And we really try to shy away from late December and January from allowing generator and transmission outages. If a generator outage is needed, we try to be careful to not let any other generators schedule outages in that area for that time, I should say that electric area for that same week or that same day or that same weekend. And the same with transmission, including a forced outage. If we have a sudden forced outage or an emergency outage of a piece of equipment, we're careful and quick to try to reschedule other infrastructure nearby so that we can meet reliability criteria. Moving on to the next slide, we spend a lot of time communicating and coordinating with a lot of energy industry and regulatory entities and reliability entities, including NERC, state agencies, including the New York State the Department of Public Service and NYSERDA. We spend a lot of time speaking to other ISOs, but primarily our neighbors, whether it's Hydro-Quebec or Ontario, PJM, which is primarily for us Pennsylvania and New Jersey, and then New England, which is primarily Vermont, Connecticut, and Massachusetts, just to understand, are they predicting to be short? Are they predicting to be long? Do they have forced outages? What is their situation? Because we are all interconnected, and there's a pretty strong interaction between the infrastructure. We, as part of our fuel survey, we are asking more and more questions about cold weather maintenance and readiness, and we're getting a lot of good responses back from our generators in their preparedness for cold weather. And let's see. It's okay, Zach, we can go to the next slide. And one thing we did really pick up on a pretty significant lessons learned from the, I'll call it Texas, but it's really the ERCOT and SPP cold weather events of February 2021, but it's primarily Texas. They did have an issue. They had a lot of cold weather. They had a lot of problems. But one thing that happened in Texas is when they needed to open up customers or shed load to keep generation and load in balance to maintain 60 cycles, unfortunately, some important electrical circuits to the gas infrastructure were opened up and were curtailed as part of their load shedding scripts. And as a result, they've then lost additional gas capability and they lost additional generation and had to shed additional load. That was a strong lessons learned for us. And we spent a lot of time this summer and this fall working with the Northeast, but primarily the New York State gas companies to understand, to ask them, please tell us exactly what electric circuits are critical to keep your gas system running. And then we go back to the electric utilities and work with them to make sure that they're not going to shed those circuits in the unlikely event we need to order load shedding. So that was a gigantic lessons learned out of Texas. I'm very happy to report that I believe we've exhausted that and picked up on that recommendation. I think that takes us to gas electric coordination. We do have a good communications protocol between ourselves and other state agencies, and in the event a generator needs a discussion with the state of New York or an agency on, it could be anything, but usually emission rules and waivers, we have a very good coordinated, what we refer to as a call tree, where we can quickly get the right authorities on a telephone. And when I say quickly, it's almost minutes. It's not hours and days. We can really, if a generator requests some assistance from the state of New York or discussion or explanation, we can arrange that quickly. And we've used that a couple times, and I have to say it's worked very, very well. We do have emergency communication protocols in place between ourselves on the electric transmission operation side and the gas, the New York State gas pipeline system. And if we were in a real tight spot and very close to shedding load, we have the capability to see what the gas industry can do with their tariffs and with their rules to maybe come up with some additional storage or flexibility or capability to help us keep the electric system running and keep the lights on. And then I think that takes us to the last slide, operator situational awareness. We've done a lot of work in recent years to, we have a long history of course, our role is running the electric transmission system, but we've expanded our visibility in the control room to include certainly some fuel systems, the wind, how much wind we currently have, how much wind we're forecasting, solar, but especially the gas pipeline system, both the interstate, the intrastate, and the gas LDC systems. And to the extent that their systems are very tight, they issue different degrees of what's referred to as operational flow orders or OFOs, and we display those clearly for our operators so that they can understand what flexibility exists on the fuel system, on the gas fuel systems for the generating fleet. And that's just fantastic operational situational awareness. And we do a very good job, as I said earlier, getting accurate information from all generators on their fuel inventory. So I'm confident that we know at all times how much energy, or I should say how much fuel all the generators have on site, what their off-site storage is, and their replacement capabilities. So, all right, that's the end of my remarks.
Great. Thank you, Wes. As a quick reminder, this is being recorded for internal purposes. Those of you from the press who are on the Microsoft Teams, we're going to go to you first. If you have a question, please use the raise hand feature. I will then unmute your microphone, announce your name. For those of you on the phone, if you can wait till we work through the folks on Teams first, and then we'll turn it over to you. I see Jared Anderson has raised his hand.
Thanks, everybody, for holding the briefing. A couple quick questions. I saw just before that some of the forward gas prices in New England have come down, I guess about 20% from October highs. Have you seen that in New York at all? Some of the forward gas prices maybe relaxing a bit from where they were?
Actually, this week I've seen a little bit in the last 3 or 4 or 5 days. When I say a little bit, I mean like 3%. So 3% doesn't sound like a lot, but in 2 or 3 days it is. So a little bit in the last 3 or 4 or 5 days. I guess you're asking about the futures prices for January. I guess I wouldn't be familiar if they've dropped in the last week or two for the New York indexes. I assume you're asking about the January futures.
Yeah. just any of those winter months. I happen to see that about
It is likely as not that we're following New England a little bit or a lot. So whatever you're seeing for New England, it might be something close for the New York indexes.
Great. Okay, thank you. And then I noticed I was looking at some of that Gold Book data for the winter forecasts. What's driving the demand increases in the winter closer to 2030?
In the year 2030.
Are you talking about, I'm sorry, Jared, you're talking about the forward year, the year 2030 increases. Is that what you're asking about?
Yeah. If you look at the Gold Book winter peak demand forecasts, they start to jump up as you get further out. Is that due to heat pumps and electric vehicles and that sort of thing? I just wanted to confirm.
Yeah, that's exactly right. When you start thinking about the decarbonization on a more economy-wide basis, it's the penetration of both electric vehicles as well as heat pumps and the conversion of the building stock to electrical heating systems, whether it's heat pumps or what have you. And we project on the most longer range, on some of our climate studies, we anticipate that by 2039 or 2040 will be a winter peaking system as that electrification continues.
Okay, thanks. And just the last quick question was that I noticed last year there was a link to a wider report regarding winter reliability. Is that report available this year as well? This was in the public press release that you guys put out last November, I guess it was.
Yeah, Jared, this is Zach. We'll provide that for you next week. It's going to be tied to the MC presentation. It's just not posted yet, so but we wanted to have the briefing today. But I will follow up and send that to you.
Okay, perfect. That's it for me. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, Jared. James, I see you have your hand raised. You should be able to unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, thanks. I'm wondering, you mentioned ERCOT and the kind of feedback they had where electricity would knock out natural gas and that would lead to more problems with electricity. But there's also problems on the natural gas system. How confident are you in the New York natural gas system that they would maintain reliability in a once in a century event like they had in ERCOT? I assume that they're also more insulated against the weather and stuff up there too.
Yeah, thank you. We have had those conversations with the New York gas companies, and keep in mind when I say New York gas companies, that include the interstate pipelines like Iroquois, Millennium, Transco, Empire, and it includes the utility gas LBCs like Niagara Mohawk, NYSEG, Central Hudson, and Con Edison, and certainly National Grid out on Long Island and Brooklyn Union Gas. Yeah, we've had those conversations across the industry. We've talked about Texas, and again, we have a lot of cold weather in the Northeast, and we have for decades, if not centuries, and they just seem to be better prepared for that. And so in Texas, the difference between once in a century and once in a decade might be something like 30 degrees to 10 degrees or 20 degrees to 20 degrees to 10. In New York, the 50-50 and 90-10 are already in the 0 to minus 10 range. So if somebody said it might go to minus 20 or minus 30, that the gas companies are not thinking that that's any more impactful or that they don't have any concerns above and beyond. They're already prepared for minus 10. So we're relatively confident that the gas infrastructure will work well in once in a century cold snap conditions here in New York.
Thank you.
Was that it for you, James?
Yep.
Okay, great. Noreen, if you had a question, feel free to unmute yourself. And if not, can go over to the folks on the phone. If anyone wants to jump in, please feel free.
Hi, this is Noreen. I'm on the phone for voice, but thanks for holding this. I think just to follow up on the gas supply constraints. I mean, New York typically tends to see prices pop when, like, the Southeast and the Mid-Atlantic tend to get constrained. Given that there is less flexibility with coal switching this winter in like the Mid-Atlantic, like PJM, do you see those like issues like cascading into New York? Is that like a concern? Those fuel supply issues.
Yeah, that's a good question, and we get that question a lot. There's always the supply component of gas costs, and then there's the pipeline transportation of the basis difference for the prices. So in New York, usually, even in cold weather, the gas prices are relatively low in western New York. And then we have our pipeline constraints across New York State to eastern New York and to New York City and Long Island. So you start to develop a price difference across those constraints during cold weather as entities compete for that scarce pipeline capability. This year, to your point, it's looking like the starting point in western New York is going to be higher in the past. I don't think extreme, but we're used to $2 and $3 gas prices in western New York, including during cold weather. And with some of the changes west of Buffalo, New York, and south of Buffalo, New York, I think the starting point could be higher. Now, I don't know what those futures or numbers could be. So it's one thing in a normal winter to start with $3 gas in Buffalo, and now it jumps up to 10 or 15 or 20 in New York City. I think the difference is going to be we may be starting at $5 or $10 in western New York during cold weather, and then it jumps up 15 or 20, maybe to 30, 40, 50, and maybe higher depending how cold it is. So I think the starting point will be higher, and yeah, all these markets interact with each other. So as fuel oil goes up, gas prices can go up, and the same with coal. So that they're all certainly interrelated.
So if prices do get back up to like 50, or we've seen in the past like close to 100. Are generators going to need the price cap lifted, or do you think that it's still sufficient?
Yeah, so interestingly, as the gas prices increase, when they get to the point where they start to equal or pass oil, in our markets, we do see the least cost scheduling of where generator asset owners, they have the ability to start to switch to oil, and we're probably fortunate that dynamic starts to clip somewhat how much higher or how high the gas prices go. Now, once we've switched as much oil as we can, or the oil starts getting low and there's more demand, now next thing you know, gas is setting that. So gas can surpass oil. For our price cap at $1,000, it takes a very, very high gas price times an efficient heat rate on a gas plant to get to the point where it's necessary to do that. We have brushed up against that once in a while. We have lifted that and in our tariff and in our markets. Part of the process is that we allow it, but then you need to come in a couple weeks later if you were going to bid over $1,000 and provide evidence that was your cost. And the couple times that we've done this, entities have not bid over the cap, and they have not then needed to come in with their evidence that they went over that. But we have the capability on our tariff such that somebody with a legitimate cost can get the recovery for reliability. So it'll be close this winter. We'll have to see how high the prices go. It takes a pretty high gas price for that trigger to kick in, but it very well may be possible this winter.
And then I was wondering if I could just ask a longer term question. Today, John Kerry said that by 2030, we're not going to have coal power. He didn't lay out a plan, but if you do see a massive shutdown of coal generation in PJM, MISO, and you do have that bigger call on gas, like everyone's competing for it, are you going to require generators in New York to have firm supply, or how do you deal with that potential reliability issue?
Well, this is Rich Dewey. When you think about the policies in place in New York, very clearly the legislation that was passed a couple of years ago will stipulate that the power system will work its way towards a carbon-free electric system in 20 years. Obviously, there's going to need to be carefully managed rules around how that transition takes place. And as we start looking at, the requirements of what it's going to take to, have a power system that is able to accommodate the amount of intermittence, there's always going to be some element of dispatchable resources that need to be there to firm up the wind. So, we try to look at this from a modeling standpoint. Is that a fossil fuel plant? Is that a gas plant? We look at it more in terms of, the attribute of what it needs, an attribute of what the resource needs to deliver in order to balance the renewables, and whether that's, we don't think of it in terms of the fuel. We just think of it in terms of its ability to respond when we need it to respond. The generation fleet is going to go through a gigantic transition here in the next 20 years. And, as we manage to the reliability criteria, we're going to be increasingly interested in the resource's ability to meet the schedules that they're going to need to meet. So whether that's, fuel security, whether that's guaranteed fuel, whether that's technologies for longer term storage that might become the marginal element. I think that's something that's going to play into the into the evolution of the fleet. So we don't particularly look at it in terms of fuel requirements as much as the ability to meet the capacity obligations that they take in our markets.
Got it. I have one more question. Sorry to keep asking you so many. So this winter, the peak demand is forecast to be 6.6% higher than last winter's high. It's not a huge jump, but is it fair to attribute that to the economy reopening from COVID or just colder weather?
Yeah, give me a second. So you're right. This year's our projected peak for cold weather of this late December and January is 24,025. That's actually lower than what we were forecasting going into last winter by 100 megawatts, and that's partly energy efficiency and conservation. But you're right, it's higher than the 22,542 that we experienced as an actual peak last year. And my strong recollection is last year's peak was that low because it was actually not that brutally cold. It was, I won't say mild, it wasn't mild weather, but it wasn't what we would expect for 50-50 temperatures. So quite frankly, at the time of the peak last year, or our coldest bit of cold weather, it just wasn't as cold as what we would expect on average for December and January. So I really believe it just had to do with slightly warmer temperatures than we were projecting for cold weather than any COVID impacts.
Thank you.
All right, with that, open it up to anyone else who may have a question. Otherwise, I think we covered everything. All right, and hearing none, I want to thank Rich and Wes for their time today. As I said to Jared, the full presentation will be posted in conjunction with next week's MC. If anyone would like that presentation, just shoot me an email and I'll send you the link. And other than that, thank you very much for joining us and have a great day.